Welcome back, everybody. In this episode, we're going to be discussing a paper that looks at driving abilities with visual field defects. I'm Dr. Mika, and our guest expert today for this episode is Dr. Jaci Theis, who practices at Virginia Neurooptometry and lectures internationally on topics related to brain injury and neurologic diseases. Welcome, Jaci.
Thank you.
The title of this article is The Effects of Visual Field Loss from Stroke on Performance in a Driving Simulator by Bro and Anderson, and it was published in Academy's Journal Optometry and Vision Science. So Jaci, I know you're an expert in visual fields, me not so much. So I was surprised when this paper pointed out that requirements for driving are not based in science, although now that I think about it, I should have known that. Because I know driving requirements change from state to state. And this study, interestingly, was conducted in Sweden. So can you just give us a summary of what this study was looking at?
Absolutely. So essentially what they did was they took a group of Swedish citizens who had been denied a driver's license because they had visual field loss. And then what they did was they enrolled them essentially into doing a driving simulated driver test, and then compared them with what was supposed to be age match controls, but didn't end up being age match controls because they did have some younger people who had strokes, but the age match controls were 55 to 75. And then what they did essentially was some of them actually were allowed to go back to driving. And so they compared who ended up getting into a motor vehicle accident after they were reinstated their driver's license if they passed this driver simulator test, and then looked back to see, is it safe for people with visual field defects? Essentially, that was their goal, was, is it safe for people with visual field defects to drive?
So let's talk about their findings first. So they actually, what did they conclude in terms of driving safety from a visual field perspective?
So I think that they were surprised because they found that, it used to be unanimous in their country, it looked like, from their driving restrictions, that if they had visual field loss, they weren't allowed to drive. And I think they were surprised that the driving safety couldn't be predicted from the type of visual field loss that the patient had. They did see some trends. So for instance, those that had macular sparing, if they had homonymous hemianopsia, had a better job at passing their simulator test than those had macular involvement. And similar, those with central defects didn't pass as well than those who didn't have central defects in their visual field loss. But they also found that severe visual loss in general didn't preclude the patient from being a good driver.
So I was reading about the simulator that they were using. Do you think it was rigorous enough to simulate real life driving?
I have no idea. And I feel like I read through their methods section multiple times, and I love the idea of the simulator. There's a bunch of simulators out there that you can refer patients to when they've had a stroke, and every single one is different. There are some studies that think that, simulators are the best, but there's not a lot of controlled studies out there. It's kind of the wild, wild west when it looks to getting people in driver's rehab back to driving. I think the concept, though, and if you read through the study of, they had, tests for processing speed by having them have to brake suddenly. They had some near collision or near miss kind of things that could go on. It was a very large enclosed area that actually had like a driver's setup. And you could see that they even had like a driving wheel and a seat. So I think they tried as best they could to mimic real life driving. I don't know if I can absolutely say it was the same as real life driving, though. So
it did seem important because they could make sure that all of the subjects had the same obstacles, right? Where if they just took them for a road test, how do you make obstacles in the real world? And then if they hit an obstacle, that could be problematic in the real world. But
and that's what I love about the simulator, is that a lot of times I always tell my patients, my concern with you driving isn't necessarily you. It's your reaction to the other people who are terrible drivers out there. It's not that I think you're going to be a terrible driver. It's, I don't know if you have the ability to react to the terrible drivers out there. And that's what I like about the idea of the simulator, is that it can simulate it in a safe way. Because if someone's just doing a drive test and nobody cuts them off briefly or has a little kid run across the road, everyone's going to pass. So I think the simulators are almost a little bit better. And also there's just less anxiety, because if they fail the simulator, you're not going to have issues, like real life issues of you hit someone or any of that goes on.
So this study seems to conclude that individuals with severe loss can be safe drivers. So what do you think about that?
I had a big issue with that, because the way that they essentially said that someone was safe driver was that they looked at, okay, for the next few years after we gave you your license back, did you get in a car accident? And none of them had. but maybe they didn't get into a car accident because they only drove on back roads during low traffic times. Maybe they had a couple of near misses, but didn't report it because it wasn't truly an accident. They never hit anything. You also don't know how much they were driving. You know, there's just so many nuances to things that they didn't really dive into. So I don't know if you can totally deem that they were a safe driver just because they didn't get into any accidents. I also get concerned whenever you conclude, oh, well, we could let these people drive, because there are other studies out there that look at, of people who have visual field loss after stroke, what else do they also have?
Mm.
And only a third of people only have visual field loss. Another third will have visual field loss and eye movement problems, or visual field loss and visual processing problems, or visual field loss and visual speed problems. And those things, in my opinion, are imperative to driving. So if you can't react to something quickly, even if you have a full field of vision, you're not safe to drive. If you can't move your eyes left to right appropriately to compensate for your visual field loss, you might not be safe to drive. There's also another condition out there called anosoagnosia. And that happens when somebody has a lesion in the parietal lobe. And so they actually are in denial of their visual field loss.
Oh,
and
no.
so they just, so I think, it's not that I don't think people with Hemis can be safe drivers. They absolutely can. I think some of them can, but every individual is different, and they're very aware of their field loss. And so they're aware of their field loss. They are good at compensating for it. They know how to track more to the side because they're aware of it. But if you have someone with a stroke with a nosoagnosia and they deny they have it, they're not going to overtrack to one side or the other to compensate. And I think the other reason I think it's possible for them to be safe is because they know they have visual field loss. They're a better driver in general. They're a less distracted driver. They're less likely to drive with music on. They're not going to be looking at their phones. And I think if you did a study comparing, a teenager looking at their phone while driving compared to a senior citizen who maybe has hemi field loss, but they're very focused while driving, I think the senior citizen's probably safer. Are both of them safe though? Probably not. So I have a hard time. I love the idea of the study of, we need to be more evidence-based in how we make regulations for this population instead of just blanket saying no to everyone. But I think it's a little far-fetched to just assume that they're all safe too. So that's kind of, I'm mixed with their conclusions of their study.
Well, let's leave it there, Jackie. Thank you so much for lending us your expertise on this really important topic.